The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio, brought to you by IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. It's been said that in the pursuit of scientific proof of the reality of NDEs, veridical evidence of knowledge gained while the body is, say, lying dead in cardiac arrest, is the most convincing. And likewise, for Christians who believe in the resurrection of Jesus, nothing offers more convincing physical evidence than the artifact known as the Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth that appears to contain the image of Jesus' body at the moment of resurrection. Our guest today, Joseph Marino, is a former Benedictine monk who has been studying the Shroud of Turin since 1977. He and his late wife, Sue Benford, presented a paper at the Sindone 2000 World Congress in Orvieto, Italy, hypothesizing that the reason that the 1988 carbon-14 dating of the shroud resulted in a date range of the Middle Ages, 1260 to 1390, for the cloth was because of a 16th-century repair in the sample area. As one example of how controversial a subject this became, Raymond Rogers, one of the scientists from the Shroud of Turin research project who studied the shroud in 1978, thought their hypothesis was nonsense at first, but later concluded that Benford and Marino were probably correct, and other scientists have independently verified Rogers' findings. Joe Marino's book, Wrapped Up in the Shroud, is a chronicle of his long-time study of this enigmatic cloth, and to quote Amazon, his book, quote, recounts strange, humorous, and at times mystical events surrounding Marino's involvement, and includes Joe and Sue's tragic, touching love story. Joe, welcome to NDE Radio.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me on your show.
Well, I'm glad you found my earlier conversation with Father Walton about this very subject, and that you got in touch with me. This is going to be terrific. Joe, since I mentioned it in the introduction, let's begin with how you became involved in this lifetime study, and tell us about your own mystical experiences that were involved in helping convince you that the shroud is authentic.
Well, I was born and raised Catholic, and in my late teens and early 20s, I'd become agnostic, and I went 2 years to college and wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I quit school and got a job with the federal government, and I kind of only read, I was kind of sick of academic stuff, so once I quit my job, I just, for about 3 or 4 years, I think I only read the sports page in the comics. And after a while, I thought, I got to do something a little more significant than this. And so I started reading religion, things on religion, any religion, not just Christianity, and philosophy. And it was spring of 1977, I went to a bookstore and saw a book in the religion section called The Fifth Gospel, and it had a picture of the face from the shroud, the image that you see on the negative, which looks lifelike. And it said, "Is this the face of Jesus Christ?" And I thought, well, this looks like interesting reading. I had never heard of the shroud. Even though I was raised Catholic, of course, you hear of things like Veronica's veil and stuff like that, but I had not actually heard of the shroud. And I bought the book and read it in one sitting. It was just fascinating, and that was the year before about 40 American scientists went over to Italy to study it in 1978 in conjunction with a exposition that 3,300,000 people saw. And I was pretty open-minded at the time, since I wasn't an adherent to any religion or anything. And the evidence seemed convincing to me that it could be and probably was the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. So I looked at the bibliography and started collecting articles, and then I contacted the Holy Shroud Guild in New York State and got some slides and started corresponding with researchers and scientists. And it actually kind of got me back into my original faith, and I ended up joining a monastery in 1980. And I put together some slides for a lecture and started lecturing. Was pretty nervous at first, but I was so into the subject matter, I kind of forgot about my nervousness and was just able to give the data. And I just, kind of really, as I do now, try to keep up to the minute. It's just a subject that grabbed me from the very beginning and has never let go. And one of my first mystical experiences was, this is over 35 years ago, but it's still as fresh in my mind as if it happened yesterday. So I was starting to collect all the books I could get on the Shroud, etc. And I had a small booklet called The Holy Shroud and Four Visions, and it recounted the visions that 4 nuns had over in history about the Shroud. And I had actually lost the booklet, but it was a condensed version of a bigger book that I was able to order, and I knew the bigger book was coming, so I wasn't that concerned that I couldn't find the booklet. So along the lines, I was actually given what was supposed to be a shroud relic, an authentic shroud relic. Turns out later it was actually only part of the kind of a covering cloth and not the real shroud itself. Mm-hmm. But at the time, I thought it was authentic. And a nephew of mine had a brain tumor, and I was going to take the relic to the hospital and touch it to his head. So the day I was going to go, I was in my cell in the monastery and kind of thinking about the theology of relics affecting cures, which, of course, is in the realm of mystical theology. And as I was thinking of that, it just kind of reminded me of the lost booklet, because that's, also mystical theology, the visions that the nuns had. And at the precise moment I thought of the lost booklet, I heard a noise behind me, and I turned around, and the booklet, which I had no idea where it was, literally hit on the floor behind my back. I heard it hit the ground. And wow. I hadn't taped it to the ceiling, so I have no rational explanation of where it came from. But I think it was just God's way of saying, yeah, mystical theology is valid. So that was one event. And then another one, I went to my first Shroud Conference in 1986 and met some of the scientists in person for the first time, and I was very excited. And there were 7 speakers, and 5 of them thought that you could not explain the Shroud, and 2 of them believed it was a fake. And one of them was Dr. Walter McCrone, who had been saying since 1980 he thought the Shroud was a painting, even though his findings disagreed with all of the STIRP team members. So when the conference was over, an AP story came out, and it featured McCrone's findings, saying it was a painting, and it made it look like this was a new revelation, when in fact he had been saying it for 6 years already at that point. And I was really upset with the way that the story was covered, because 5 of the 7 thought it was probably authentic. So when I got back to St. Louis, I was working in the school that the monastery ran, and I was busy all day, but all I had in my mind was getting to my room and writing a letter to the editor explaining the situation and complaining about the way the story was covered. So finally the school day ended, and I'm literally rushing to my room to write this letter down. And I had this experience that unless you've had one of these, it's almost hard to explain. And I later found out it's called a locution, L-O-C-U-T-I-O-N.
Mm-hmm.
And a locution is sort of like an inner voice that you hear that you know is from outside of you. So one of my jobs, sort of unofficial jobs at the monastery, was picking up trash. And I wasn't assigned it, but I did it because, the campus got very littered and it drove me nuts to see trash all around. So I regularly picked up trash. And as I'm rushing to my room with, one-track mind about writing this letter, I hear an inner voice say, "Go pick up trash." And I was just really startled by this. Like, I'm not saying this to myself. Somebody's telling me this. And it was so strong and insistent. I thought, you know what? I'm not going to ignore this. The last thing on earth I want to do right now is go pick up trash. But I think I better go pick up trash. So I spent a good hour picking up trash, and then I'm literally ready to rush back to the monastery again. I was in one of the parking lots of the near the church, and I hear a car door, and I turned around, and it was the executive vice president of the local CBS affiliate radio, KMOX radio in St. Louis, which is a 100,000 watt station, very powerful. You can hear on a good night. You can hear it in Canada, and I knew the gentleman kind of briefly from him coming to the church, and I said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Hyland. Did you see the article on the Shroud in the paper this morning? It was totally, misleading." And he said, well, "I heard about it, but I haven't read it." He says, "Oh, I'll tell you what." He says, "Call John Angelides at the station, and let's do an interview with you on the World of Religion," which was a program that was done in St. Louis, but then broadcast nationally. So called the guy the next day, and we set something up. I went down to the studio, and I actually ended up debating Walter McCrone on the radio. And I was a little nervous because I had never done any radio or TV at that point, and was a world microscopist. And the moderator told me he was not that impressed with McCrone's arguments, and so I felt like I at least held my own. So the fact that I heard this voice tell me to go pick up trash, and as a result of that, I ended up on a national program.
Wow.
Says to me that was orchestrated. So those are kind of the two of the bigger ones. And then just a little background on Sue. Sue would get some it's what I would call spiritual insights often. And at one point we were trying to track down a missing shroud sample. After that Ray Rogers had, but after he died, it wasn't known where the sample was. And at one point, she got one of her insights, and she says, "Somebody named Bob has it." And she had, she had no reason to say that other than, there was no rational way she could have known that. And as it turns out, Barry Schwartz, the documenting photographer who runs the big Shroud website, Shroud.com.
Shroud.com, yes.
Yeah. He got Ray Rogers' computer and got some information, and he called Los Alamos National Laboratories, where Ray Rogers used to work, and he discovered that the sample had been given to Robert Villarreal. And Sue had no way of knowing that, but she said, "Somebody named Bob has it." So even my life with Sue was interesting with somebody with those capabilities. And it was just interesting the year we corresponded before I left the monastery. I would get weird things happen sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, which is something called synchronicities, which are kind of like meaningful coincidences where I'd be thinking something in my head and then somebody would say something that they had no idea what I was thinking, but their answer would be a direct reply or a solution to what I'm thinking. And stuff like that happened, like I say, almost every day, sometimes 2-3 times a day for a year. And so Sue and I, felt like we were really called together to do that work. And we, in fact, even though I was somewhat established as a shroud researcher, we would have never been able to do the research that we did had we not literally gotten together.
Now, she called you originally because of the shroud, didn't she?
That's correct.
I got that impression. Yeah. She got in touch with you. You were still in the monastery at that time?
That's right.
Talk about something that was meant to be. That's a powerful, not a coincidence at all that you two were interested in the shroud.
Yeah, she called some other researchers first, who basically kind of said they didn't have time to deal with her, but they gave her my name, and she called me, and one thing led to another, and I ended up leaving the monastery and going out to her home in Columbus, Ohio, in 1998.
Yeah. God had another assignment for you, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Joe, apparently, I'd like to talk a little about the shroud itself at this point. And apparently little is known about the early history of the shroud. One report I read stated that the features of Christ, as they are generally accepted today, date from 525 A.D., when the shroud was found in the ruins of the West Gate House of Odessa, the result of a disastrous flood that devastated much of the city. And then it says before that date, his image was generally portrayed as that of a Hellenistic young man, notably to be seen in various sarcophagi of the Roman period in the Vatican museums. But back in 1987, I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, and I went to an icon museum there. What was purportedly a 4th century painting of Jesus' face, and it was in the traditional style of Jesus. I don't know if the shroud had been seen before that, and people had copied the. What do you know about that early history?
That's pretty accurate the way you displayed it. That's what most of the shroud historians believe. Now, I think the first depiction of Jesus in the catacombs was about, I think, 250 A.D., and that was somewhat more like the traditional representation rather than the Roman one. So, of course, a lot just depends on the context. Jews and Christians, or really, I guess the Christians, because the Jews wouldn't do depictions. The Christians would have done more of a representation the way they thought it, rather than a strictly Roman one. Whereas non-Christians and Romans and stuff would tend to depict them in the Roman style.
Right.
So, the early history is a little murky. I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few representations before the 6th century where it looks a little like the traditional representation. But you just have to kind of remember, there was no internet in those days, and communication was slow, and of course the shroud was probably hidden for hundreds of years, so there wasn't a lot of knowledge about what it looked like, or seeing other pictures to be able to base it on. So there'd be some word of mouth and stuff like that. But generally, it is true that just get to after like 544, when it was supposedly discovered after the flood in Odessa from 525, most of the representations begin to look like the shroud face. And in fact, there was a researcher named Paul Vignon in the early 1900s that kind of cataloged something like 15 different characteristics on on the shroud face that he noted on Byzantine icons from the 6th through the 12th centuries.
And then in, I guess 1204 or thereabouts, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, and the Knights Templar were part of that group, and they could very well have been the ones that brought the shroud back to Europe. I know Ian Wilson wrote the Shroud of Turin burial cloth of Jesus, and he made the claim that the Templars worshipped the picture of the face of Jesus on the shroud. I guess they called it the Mandylion.
It had become known as the Mandylion in 944 when the image of Edessa was brought there to Constantinople, and then it became known as the Mandylion at that point, and as you said, was stolen in 1204 in the Fourth Crusade, and then it kind of disappeared for about 150 years. There's an Italian historian, she's a Vatican archivist named Barbara Frale, found a document recently that does seem to indicate that the Templars seem to be worshiping some head on a cloth. So it's very likely that the Templars did have it in that period between 1204 and when it publicly surfaces around 1355 in Lorraine, France.
Mm. And then there was a report that, I don't know if it was a priest or a bishop from the Middle Ages sometime, said that he thought the shroud was a fake and that he'd found the artist who'd made it, and the artist had confessed that he'd made it and so forth. But after that, the Catholic Church has always thought it to be authentic up until recently. So what's the story with that?
Well, of course, one has to remember the belief in a relic is never something that's required for Catholics or anything. It's never a dogma of faith. Basically, the Church lets you venerate an object as long as there is no, significant evidence that it's a fake. Mm-hmm. And although many popes have stated personally that they believe that the shroud is authentic, it's never a dogma. So the fact that they're still exhibiting it after the carbon-14 test of 1988 shows that they don't believe that evidence is concrete that it's a fake. So it's really left up to the individual if they want to believe it's authentic or not, but it would never be required.
Mm. Now, there seems, besides the carbon-14 thing, which we'll get into in detail, there are other things that they've said authenticate the shroud. One is the weave in the cloth is appropriate to the place and time of Jesus' death. That they found traces of pollen from Middle Eastern plants, and the fact too, and I think it was Schwartz that said that the bilirubin in the blood, which is generated by torture and extreme pain and anxiety, I guess, in the victim, the blood stays red, and the blood did stay red on the cloth, which was an indication that this really had been someone who'd been tortured. It wasn't just an artistic rendering.
That's correct. And of course, unless you're a blood expert or a medical expert, who's going to know that? And certainly a 14th century forger would know something like that. And he would have been hundreds of years ahead of his time in medical knowledge and stuff. One of my original slides that I ought to get digitized sometimes, I've got a diagram of in the 17th century, kind of a medical diagram, and it's cartoonish. I mean, it's so primitive, and that's the 17th century. So it's amazing that it really, I find it impossible to believe that somebody in the 14th century knew enough medicine to incorporate venous blood flows, arterial blood flows, and I mean, he would have had to been an expert in Roman crucifixion. The wounds match the Roman flagrum, the crown of thorns match kind of thorn can be found in Israel. The spear wound matches a Roman lancia at the time. I mean, there is just so much evidence pointing toward authenticity. And that bishop in 1389 that said he found the artist, I think it's very possible he could be referring to a copy that was made at the time.
Right. That would explain that.
Yeah. And then there's the whole thing of, permissions and stuff. One of the, Geoffroy de Charny had gone over the bishop's head to get the plot exhibited and stuff. And then, the bishops got upset about that. And they were each trying to get money for their churches and whatnot. So you can't really take that at face value, that he said, that he knew who the artist was. I mean, you can find medieval documents that say the world is flat, but that doesn't mean it's true,
Plus the fact that they don't even know how an artist would have rendered this thing. They don't have it's not paint, it's not it's not a photo. They didn't have photography back then, and they couldn't do it photographically anyway.
Right. And I think one of the biggest indications scientifically that the image can't be duplicated is that some Italian scientists in Italy in around 2011 used the ultraviolet excimer laser and were able to come fairly close to the color and penetration of the shroud on a piece of linen, using 2 to 5 billion watts in 1/40 billionth of a second. Now, if you extrapolate, they said to do a whole front and back image, you would need billions and billions of what. There isn't enough power to do that even today. It just the idea of an artist doing it is really ludicrous if you really get down to it and do all the study of the different aspects of the intricacy of the image.
So that being the case, why do you suppose that so many people were disillusioned with this carbon-14 test that they did? I mean, there's so much more evidence of a different nature than the carbon-14 that seems to prove the authenticity of the shroud.
So you're asking why so much stock is put into that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a complicated story, too. I think the 3 labs that did the test, I think they were very interested in promoting their C14 method. And the shroud was just the perfect vehicle to do that. And originally, there were supposed to be more than 3 labs. There were going to be like 7 labs. Mm-hmm. And then it was reduced to 3. And they kind of complained a little bit, but the scientific advisor to the cardinal said, well, to the 3 labs that were left, well, if you don't want to do it, we'll get, other labs to do it. And they kind of clammed up and said, okay, we'll do it. The carbon-14 industry just kind of exploded after that. I mean, it's like a billion or trillion dollar industry now.
So it was a way to market a scientific technique more than it was a genuine exploration of the shroud. Oh,
I think, yeah, the search for the truth of the shroud was really secondary. In 2016, I did a 3-part, 75-page article called The Politics of the Radiocarbon Dating of the Turin Shroud. Mm-hmm. And if you just look at there was just backstabbing, egos. I think most of the people involved were not concerned about really finding out the truth about the shroud. It was really about stature, power, ego, money, and that sort of thing.
Human nature, in other words. Joe, We are out of time, but this is such a fascinating subject. We will continue this next week. So thank you for now, Joe Marino, for sharing your story up to this point. And we hope that listeners will go out and find your book between now and next Monday. It's The book is titled Wrapped Up in the Shroud, Chronicle of a Passion. If you'd like to listen again to this show or any of our past shows, just go to our website at NDE Radio for information on IANDS and the upcoming IANDS conference in Valley Forge, PA. Check out that website at IANDS.org. And join us again next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern, for more NDE Radio with Joe Marino. This is Lee Witting saying thanks for listening.